Hello, friends. I'm glad you joined us again. It's Talking Heads of Atascocita. I am Amy Bridwell, joined on the phone by Msgr James Golasinski, and this is part 3 this week. And we needed a part 3 because today is the anniversary of a very significant day in our history. What day is it, Msgr?
The 75th anniversary of the dropping of the atomic bomb on Hiroshima in 1945.
1945. I
remember it very, very well. I was 11 years old, close to being 12, and the news was electrifying. Electrifying. But before I go into that, notice it happened on the Feast of the Transfiguration. And when we think of the Transfiguration, what do we think of? Don't we think of
that dazzling white light?
And heat.
That's right.
Yeah. So the coincidence is really, really interesting. And I can remember when the news spread across the country, it was electrifying. To us, it meant the war is over. The war is over. You know, our uncles, our cousins, they're going to be able to come back home after being away for years.
I understand.
And it was a great, great celebration. Of course, over time, people have thought about it, and even my first assignment, after I was ordained in 1958, I remember there were some people who were questioning the use of that. I remember this one parishioner, St. Michael's, who said, couldn't we have had a demonstration somehow? You know, I mentioned a little in a previous talk that from the city of Busan, where I was, you can look out on a clear day and see the outline of the mountains on this island, about midway between Korea and Japan. Why couldn't we have dropped it on that thing? But anyway, people don't realize that what the damage that was done was only, I think, 8% of the damage our aerial warfare wreaked upon Japan. Most people think that was horrendous. Actually, there were more lives lost in one night when Tokyo was bombed. 16 square miles of Tokyo were incinerated. Over 100,000 people died. And a lot of it was horrible. I mean, a firestorm developed, and people were trying to find places to flee to. They were jumping in to drainage ditches, going into steel reinforced buildings, like say a school building, say a 3-story brick school building. Because most of Japan in those days, it was just flimsy, wood and paper. And anyway, the ones who jumped in those canals, they boiled. Their flesh was boiled. The ones who went in those concrete buildings, their flesh was roasted. That's what happened that first night. Because what happened was that it was decided to use incendiary warfare against the cities of Japan. And we started out with cities over 5 million. Then those say between 2.5 and 5 million. Then between 2 and 2.5 million. And kept going all the way down. We were down to 100,000 or under 100,000. There's a book called A Torch to the Enemy. It's the history of that aerial warfare against Japan in the final days of World War II. John Hershey, who was a popular writer in the middle of the 20th century, wrote a book called Hiroshima. It has 6 chapters in it. And each chapter deals with a certain person or a certain group. Like there was one, I remember one was a doctor, another was a nurse, another was a Methodist minister. By the way, he visited here in the early 60s or middle 60s when I was superintendent of schools. The principal down in Texas City, or St. Mary's in Texas City, invited
Oh, my goodness.
How many people have that opportunity when they're in elementary school?
Mm-hmm. Not many.
He was one of those. One of those. His story was one of the 6 chapters of the book. But the reason I'm bringing the book up is, guess what? I knew a Jesuit who was there at Hiroshima.
Oh, my goodness.
Yeah, not well. Unfortunately, see, I arrived in Korea in 1967, and I and 2 other priests started living with the Jesuits at their college in Seoul while attending language school elsewhere. And there were 4 Korean Jesuits on the staff. The college had been established by the Wisconsin province of Jesuits. They were given Korea as a mission territory. And anyway, among one of those 4 was Father Thomas Pak. Now he was I can't remember whether the older ones had gone to Japan for their novitiate. There was one, Father Yun. He didn't go there. He snuck into China and became a Jesuit in China and then snuck back into Korea. These stories are fabulous. I've known some interesting people. But anyway,
how do you spell Pak? How do you spell Pak, Father Thomas Pak?
Usually, in this country, they spell it P-A-R-K.
Oh, okay.
The Korean pronunciation is Pak.
Okay.
It's like P-O-C-K.
Yes.
But sometimes when the Koreans write the Korean names, they don't use the sound of a word we have in English because it's kind of negative, huh? Pak.
Oh, I understand.
Pockmarked, huh?
Right.
But one of the Korean names, family names, is No, N-O.
Oh, that's funny.
So usually they say Ro instead of No. But anyway, Father Thomas Pak was at Hiroshima. See, Korea was part of Japan. People should not regard Korea as having been like a colony. Say, like Cuba was a colony of Spain. What happened was the Japanese, by piecemeal, just incorporated the Korean Peninsula into the Japanese Empire over a 5-year period from 1905 to 1910. And the German Jesuits were the ones who had been assigned Japan as their mission territory. See, that's the way the church worked for missionary work. They would assign different religious orders and missionary institutes to take over a certain part of the world. And anyway, Jesuit novitiate for Japan and Korea was in Hiroshima, and Father Thomas Pak was a novice that day. And there's a chapter in that book of John Hersey devoted to the Jesuits. They suffered no damage, no harm.
That's miraculous.
Well, much of what happened, if you're not at the epicenter, and you have something that's shielding you from radiation, that can protect you. You've probably heard people ridicule the idea back during the Cold War, how there would be practice in the schools, the children would get under their desks. People ridicule that. It might have worked for some people because it so happens that, you go to your dentist and you have X-rays. What happens?
Yeah, they put that iron apron on you.
Yeah. Why do they do that? Yeah, I think it's lead.
Oh, sorry. I guess iron would be the wrong material, wouldn't it?
Yeah, so they were spared. Nothing happened to any of those Jesuits who were there. And later on in Paris life, the reason I got to know him, I was with two other Americans, and he had an aunt who was the novice mistress of a flourishing Korean community, a nursing community.
Mm-hmm.
And they had their novitiate midway between Seoul and Incheon.
Mm-hmm.
And they didn't always have a priest available for daily mass.
Mm-hmm.
And so what happened was I and these other two priests, we would go for mass there at their novitiate.
Mm-hmm.
It was still the Latin, wasn't the vernacular yet.
Oh. Mm-hmm.
And so even though we didn't know the language, we were able to be effective.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so the three of us took 2 masses a week.
Mm-hmm.
Well, later, I'm pastor of a parish in Busan, Korea.
Mm-hmm.
And I started having contact with people who had connections with Hiroshima.
Mm-hmm.
And Nagasaki, because I need to, at this point, mention that 3 days later, on August the 9th, the second bomb was dropped on Nagasaki.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Nagasaki was sort of the capital of Japanese Catholicism. There was a huge church there, huge church, and it was full that morning when the bomb was dropped on Nagasaki. Huge loss of life.
Mm-hmm.
Some people have wondered if there was some kind of anti-Catholic conspiracy
Mm-hmm.
that had caused that.
Mm-hmm.
And really, I don't think there was.
Mm-hmm.
Because when there is bombing, you have a problem with overcast, with cloudiness.
Mm-hmm.
And Nagasaki was the third on the list that day.
Mm-hmm.
2 others were supposed to be the targets, and there was bad weather.
Mm-hmm.
Those other 2, and so by default, Nagasaki was the one that suffered it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And it so happened that I spent a little time with the pastor of that parish, and one that was destroyed.
Mm-hmm.
He and another priest came over on vacation, went to Korea.
Mm-hmm.
They were SVD priests, Society of the Divine Word.
Okay.
We have some here in Houston. It's St. Peter, or rather St. Mary the Purification, and the Holy Name, I think.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
And the parish, once again, was a flourishing parish.
Mm-hmm.
And guess what was also there in Nagasaki? The friary established by, are you ready? St. Maximilian Kolbe.
Oh my word! Oh my goodness!
So many people don't realize that he spent some time in Japan.
And St. Maximilian Kolbe. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And where the site he selected for the friary was behind a hill that shielded the friary from the blast at Nagasaki.
Mm-hmm. God honors the work of saints, doesn't he? That is amazing. I had no idea. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there's a Jesuit connection to Hiroshima, and there's a Franciscan connection to Nagasaki.
Mm-hmm.
And I had a number of parishioners. Because Korea was part of the Japanese Empire, people were going from Korea. Some of them were being forcibly taken. Sort of like slave labor. You know, there's a long, thin island north of Hokkaido, the most northern of the major home islands. It's called Sakhalin. Before World War II, the defeat of Japan, the southern half was Japanese. The northern half was Russian. And there are a lot of coal mines there on Sakhalin Island. There's oil too, by the way.
Oh, wow.
One of our Annunciation parishioners, a young fellow who works for Exxon, he'll be over there for 2 months, and then he'll be back for a while, and then go for another 2 months there to Sakhalin Island. But anyway, those at the end of World War II, when the Russians retook the southern half from Japan, those poor Koreans got trapped there. The Russians wouldn't let them out. There was no contact whatever. Relatives in Korea didn't know whether or not those slave laborers of the Japanese were alive or dead. But I had there was a girl in our parish. She was a very, very lovely, simple girl. Mm-hmm. She had only a few years of elementary school. She was the oldest of, well, I don't know how many children. Mm-hmm. Her father died. Oh. And she went to work at an early age. Mm-hmm. It wasn't happening by the time I got there, but a few years earlier, girls as young as 10 were going to work in clothing factories.
Oh, my goodness. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, 10 years of age. Mm-hmm. And so she didn't have an opportunity to get much schooling. Mm-hmm. And she was working in one of these big clothing factories. Mm-hmm. I mean, we had monstrous ones there in the city of Busan. Mm-hmm. There was one operated by the Tayu Group at 10,000 employees.
Oh, wow. That is
under
huge.
one roof. Mm-hmm. 9,000 young females, girls, teenage girls, and people in their 20s. They were manning the big, powerful sewing machines, and there were 1,000 young fellows. The fellas, they cut the cloth.
Oh, wow.
And then the young ones, young girls, they then sewed the pieces together. And she was working in one of those places. And, I guess it was about 3 or 4 years before I came back here that we baptized her. And one day I was in my office, and there was a knock on the door, and I said, "Come in." And she came in, greeted me, and then sat down on the floor next to my desk. The only furniture I had in my office was the desk and chair. Back in those days in Asia, people sat on the floor. And she sat there for maybe 5 minutes, not speaking a word.
No.
And finally, she got up the courage, and she told me how there was a fellow at work who had a lot of education. He graduated from high school, and he had taken an interest in her. But she didn't know whether or not to reciprocate, because she then proceeded to tell me her father was at Hiroshima. Guess what her worry was?
What?
Well, there were stories that people who had been at Hiroshima or Nagasaki, that they suffered genetic damage. They could pass it on to their offspring.
Oh, my goodness.
So she didn't know whether or not she should marry or not.
Oh, poor baby. Oh.
Yeah. And so that's what she wanted to talk about. Well, by that time, it was 30 years after. It was in the middle of the 70s. And I told her, I said, well, I've heard about that concern, but I haven't heard of any of it happening. And so anyway, we had a wedding.
Oh,
we married her happily.
Yay. Wonderful. I like a happy ending. I hope it was a happy ending.
Well, let me go on to something I saw on the internet yesterday. Did you ever see that movie, The Bridge on the River Kwai?
No, I did not.
Do you know anything about it?
No, I've never heard of it, Monsignor.
Oh my gosh, it was an extremely popular movie.
Okay, I'll have to look it up.
The late 1950s. Okay. The melody is just dun 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 dun. You heard that melody?
Yes,
that was the theme song.
Okay.
And it had to do with the building of this railroad in Burma. And anyway, these were Englishmen, and the Japanese were not very good at building bridges, and so these British prisoners of war, they took over to show them how, and we Westerners, we have the know-how, and anyway, that's what it's all about.
Okay.
I despise the movie.
Oh, it wasn't. So maybe it wouldn't be a good family movie night. Just a good theme song.
I despise the movie.
Okay.
Because the suffering of those men on that railroad, they were prisoners of war, and Burmese natives. And I came across accidentally on the internet yesterday a documentary, a 2-part documentary put out by BBC. What is distinctive about it, here's the title of it. World War II, Building Burma's Death Railway.
Mm.
That's how it's known to historians.
Mm-hmm.
The Burma Death Railway.
Mm.
It might come as a surprise to you, but the Japanese wanted to invade India.
Mm.
Did you know that?
No, I didn't. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I did not.
Yes, I mean they swept through. They swept through all of Southeast Asia,
Mm-hmm.
Thailand, Burma.
Mm-hmm.
Burma was a British colony or whatever they designated. The British had different designations for different places that they were ruling, and they were on their way to India. I mean, there was an Indian independence movement during World War II in India. They were looking for an opportunity to get out from under British rule, and it seemed like the Japanese would help them. And so the Japanese were intending to invade India, but there was a problem of supplies. Burma has some of the most inhospitable geography on the face of the earth.
Okay.
In the British days, they had considered building a railroad. They gave up on it. So much for that British know-how. Well, because there was a transportation problem of supplying their forces, the Japanese decided to first to supply them by ship. We quickly established a submarine base at Fremantle. It's one of the two major cities, or in those days, two major cities on the west coast of Australia. And we also put in some bomber bases in India. And so our submarines and our bombers were sinking these Japanese supply ships as they were, hugging the Burma coast. And so what the Japanese then decided to do, well, we'll have to put a railroad in. Now, at Singapore, when the British surrendered at Singapore, there was over 100,000, over 100,000 prisoners of war. And there were actually they were mainly Australians and Englishmen. I read the memoir of at least two of these men. The suffering was incredible. This documentary I saw yesterday said it was estimated that a third of 1,000,000 people worked on it.
Oh, wow.
And 100,000 died.
Oh, no.
They died of malnutrition. They died of disease. Just all sorts of things. And this documentary, it has photographs of that sort. But what caught my attention, and the reason I'm bringing it up in this context, is their interviews with Englishmen who survived. I think this documentary was made 5 years ago. These are old men in their 90s. And then there are interviews with Japanese soldiers.
Oh, wow.
Who were the oppressors. And it was just fascinating to watch and listen to these old men. And the reason I'm bringing this up is one of these Japanese soldiers, when asked about us using the bomb, he said it was good because it ended the war. It ended the war. He said we were ready, to fight to the death. A lot of Americans don't realize that, but they were even organizing children. I mean, I think they were going to use spears made out of bamboo. I mean, the whole population was going to resist an American invasion. And what happened was the Japanese for so long had been saying, we've never been conquered, which was true. The Mongols tried it twice in the 1500s, in the days of Kublai Khan, and they were twice saved. The Japanese were saved by hurricanes that came along and destroyed the Mongol fleets. Do you know what they call those hurricanes? Kamikaze.
Oh, no, I didn't know that. Huh.
And in Japanese, kamikaze means divine wind. Those two typhoons, I shouldn't say hurricane. In the Pacific, we call them typhoons. And in Japanese, and in Chinese, that means big wind. And so they were always boasted they had never been conquered by anyone. And so they were never going to surrender to the United States and the other countries. They were going to fight to the death. I mean, they were organized. And women and children, they were going to be warriors.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that's what the man said. Well, it was good because it ended the war. Because what happened was, after we dropped the two at Hiroshima and at Nagasaki,
Mm-hmm.
the top rung, they said, well, things have changed.
Mm-hmm.
Things have changed.
Mm-hmm.
So we'll have to surrender.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But there was this next rung, majors, colonels, they were sort of the young Turks, the hotheads.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't want to surrender.
Oh, okay.
And it was touch and go.
Mm-hmm.
What happened was they decided to have a recording made by the emperor there in the palace that would then be played over the radio, informing the people. At the very beginning, he said, things have not turned out quite the way we intended them to be.
Not quite.
He didn't say we lost.
Not quite.
I think that was the gist of the words. Things have not quite turned out the way we intended them to be.
Yeah. Didn't meet expectations.
Yeah. What happened was these young Turks, this recording was done at the end of the day, and night fell, and these young Turks, they were trying to find that record to prevent it from being broadcast the next morning.
Yeah, they were determined.
Now, I'm going to go to another book I've read. I've read a lot of books about World War II, and it's called The Last Raid, written by an American airman who was in the part of the last air raid upon Japan. I guess it was the night of the 14th, August 14th. And they didn't want to go. After we dropped the two bombs, everybody figured the war is over. And yet they got orders to bomb this refinery. And they had to pass over Tokyo. It was in some place north of Tokyo, and they had to pass over Tokyo. One of the reasons why these guys didn't want to do it is you don't want to be the last one to die in a war, do you?
Yeah.
And the B-29s, they were starting to wear out.
Yeah.
And so they really didn't want to go, but they went. And you know what? They passed over Tokyo, which caused a blackout in Tokyo. And in the darkness, these majors and colonels were not able to find the guys who had the record.
Oh, so it saved them. Wow.
Yeah.
What a turn of events. Oh, my goodness.
Because of that blackout, they weren't able to get their hands on that record and destroy it. And I'm going to finish up now with going now to Maryknoll. There was a wonderful Maryknoll priest named Brennan. He was the one who first led Maryknollers to Korea and then to Japan. And he and of course the other Maryknollers, they were interned. But because he was the superior and he had become respected among the Japanese, he was under house arrest. And you know what? They put him on the radio. And he broadcast to the population of Japan not to be afraid of the Americans when they would start arriving there in their islands. He said, they won't hurt you. They're just going to come and they'll occupy. And so that's one of the reasons why the occupation of the islands went so smoothly. The emperor had, first of all, told his subjects that it's over. And then this Father Brennan, later he was the ambassador to Korea, and he died in North Korea in one of those death marches. And anyway, and then you know what? The American military, they put him on the air. Because you had this huge American fleet with all the occupation troops and everything landing. And so they put him on, and he broadcast to the Americans who were going to be occupying occupying, not to worry. The people are not going to resist. You won't have any trouble. Can you imagine?
No, I can't.
Yes. I mean, he was a wonderful man, and he died a martyr. He died a martyr in North Korea then in that winter of 1950-51. His name was Brennan. So anyway, these are some of the thoughts that come to my mind at this time of the year in connection with his date. Last of all, I should add that because there was so much suffering by Catholics at Nagasaki, Catholicism ceased to be as much a foreign import. See, the Japanese are very, very, very nationalistic people. They are very nationalistic. Well, in general, except for the Filipinos, I think. The people of Asia are very, very isolationistic, very xenophobic, very nationalistic. And so many of the Catholics that died in Nagasaki, they had suffered together with the other Japanese. And because they had suffered together like that, Catholicism ceased to be so much a foreign thing.
That suffering broke that barrier.
Yeah. There was some good. They came out of the dropping of the bomb. And the spirit in both Hiroshima and in Nagasaki is very different. Very, very different. Every year on this day in Hiroshima, the mayor of Hiroshima, he plays, the victim card. And for a lot of people, too, they say, well, it was racial when we dropped it on the Japanese. No. The Japanese, they had their own program. In fact, the Germans were assisting them. The Germans had theirs, too. Did you know that?
No, I did not.
Well, because the Germans had a program underway that Einstein wrote a letter to President Roosevelt and said, you better get cracking. The Germans are already ahead of us. And because of that letter of Einstein to Roosevelt, the Manhattan Project that got started, that brought us the atomic bomb there in New Mexico.
I did not know that.
Well, I've got a connection to that bombing. The Martin family. By the way, let me greet them, Mike and Jenny down there at NASA. Greetings to you and the family. They're from Massachusetts originally, and about 25 years ago, their father came down to visit the family, visit the grandchildren, and they invited me to dinner to meet him. And guess what? He had brought along all of his stuff from World War II.
Oh, wow.
Now, the Germans had their atomic operation on an island off the north coast called Premunde or something like that. And the British bombed it at night, and then our Air Force bombed it in the daytime the next day. The British bombed at night, we bombed in the daytime. And guess what? Mike Martin's father was the navigator and bombardier
of
the lead plane. When they'd have these bombing missions out of England, they'd have hundreds and hundreds of B-17s, B-24s, and there were two that were in the lead. And their point was they were supposed to be the experts, and they were the ones that were supposed to drop bombs first on that target. And if something had happened to that first plane, there was a backup. Mike Martin's father was the lead. That bombing of the German atomic facility there. Now, the Japanese, they had theirs underway also. And all three, the United States, Germany, and Japan, they had their atomic facilities.
Yeah, their programs were up and running.
We won the race. That's what it was. There's nothing racial about us dropping it there. The mayor of Hiroshima on this date always plays the victim card. Now, over in Nagasaki, you don't have something like that. In fact, and it's because I think I read that because the Catholic presidents
Mm.
You know, there was a mayor of Nagasaki some years ago who was a Catholic, and he said to his fellow citizens, you know, we should recognize the fact that we started the war in the Pacific. We shouldn't be playing a victim card.
Wow. Wow.
You know what happened later?
What was
he? Was shot. He was shot.
Oh my goodness.
Assassinated.
I was going to say ostracized, but getting shot is a little bit worse. Oh my goodness.
Yes. Yes. So at this time, as this, you know, these days are observed as as far as I can tell, it's a very, very different spirit in Nagasaki compared to Hiroshima, and it's because of the faith there in Nagasaki. Well, I think that brings me to the end of some of these things I know about those events.
Some of these things, I think you know about everything. You know, you're making me think of can you remember when you taught the World War II class to the kids at Annunciation? We should do that for Talking Heads one day. Just have a World War II history month or two. I don't know. You can think about it.
Well, maybe some of our listeners they would respond.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
You know, so many people, we Americans, American Catholics in particular, are descendants of people who turned their back on Europe. And I think that's one of the reasons many Americans haven't had much interest in history.
Oh, maybe so.
We are the descendants of people who turned their back on history. And they came forward looking to the new world. I think this had an effect. What did Henry Ford once say? History is bunk.
Oh, wow. I didn't know he said that. Oh, my goodness. That explains the Ford Foundation, doesn't it? I'm kidding. Only a little.
Okay, was there anything else?
No, thank you so much, Monsignor. Thank you for giving us a good reminder of a very historic anniversary today. And
I hope I've shed some light on some of the controversy concerning this day.
For sure.
Okay, and finally, fear not, little flock. It is pleased your Father to give you the kingdom.
Amen. Thank you, Monsignor. Thank you, friends. We'll see you soon. Bye-bye.